What if Jesus met Osama Bin Laden? In the heart of a hostile mountain, a man prayed, not in a grand cathedral, but in a cold, damp cave that served as both a sanctuary and a command center for terror. The air, thin and sharp, carried the scent of dust, gunpowder, and ancient sacred texts. Here a prayer rug lay beside an assault rifle, a symbol of a faith that had been twisted into a weapon. Maps marked with targets for destruction were illuminated by a single flickering lantern. This was not a place of doubt. It was a fortress of absolute conviction, the throne room of a man who saw himself as a righteous sword, an instrument of divine will, a general in a holy war he believed God had commanded him to wage. His power was not political in the way the world understands it. It was ideological, a far more potent force capable of turning devotion into devastation. In his own mind, he was a purifier, a warrior cleansing the world of injustice. He had built an entire kingdom upon grievance and sanctified it with scripture, convinced that his acts of violence were not sins, but sacraments. He truly believed his was a blessed terrorism, a necessary evil to stop a greater one. This conviction was his armor, a shield forged in the fires of hatred and polished with the language of piety, making him impervious to the whispers of mercy or the cries of his victims. His cause was his God. Then, a presence entered the cave. There was no sound, no dramatic entrance, just a sudden, unnerving stillness that seemed to suck the very air from the room. The shadows, once deep and comforting, did not flee from a physical light, but from a spiritual one that exposed the cave for what it truly was, a tomb for living men. The assault rifle, once a symbol of righteous power, now looked like a vulgar instrument of sorrow. The sacred texts on the table seemed to weep, their words of peace contorted into justifications for bloodshed. The atmosphere, once thick with strategic certainty, now hung heavy with a profound, unspoken judgment that questioned everything. The zealot felt it instantly, a presence that was not a spirit to be commanded, but a truth to be confronted. He clutched his prayer beads tighter, his eyes darting from the silent figure to his maps of destruction, trying to reaffirm the mission that was his very identity. But the silent authority in the room was absolute, a living embodiment of a law that shattered his entire world. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. The holy war had just met the Prince of Peace, and the foundations of the cave and the man's soul began to crack under the silent weight of a love he had long ago forsaken for power. If this encounter already makes you think, then subscribe to this channel now, because here the power of heaven confronts the thrones of the earth. The man in the cave did not see a threat. He saw a test. His entire life had been a series of trials, each one hardening his resolve, confirming his divine mandate. This silent figure was merely another phantom sent to sow doubt, a whisper of weakness to be conquered through faith. He steadied his mind, focusing on the intricate patterns of the prayer rug, reciting the verses that had become his shield and his sword. He was a guardian of purity, a soldier of God standing against a tide of godless materialism and corruption. In his heart, there was no room for negotiation or mercy, only for the absolute cleansing fire of his mission. His power was derived from this clarity, this unwavering belief that he was on the right side of eternity. This conviction was articulated in a chillingly simple doctrine, one he repeated to his followers as gospel. He believed his was a blessed terrorism, a righteous violence sanctioned by heaven itself to punish the wicked and halt the spread of injustice. This was not the chaotic evil of a madman, but the calculated strategic action of a man who saw himself as a divine surgeon, cutting away a cancer from the body of the world. He had convinced himself, and legions of others, that planting bombs was no different than planting seeds of righteousness. The cries of the innocent were drowned out by the thunderous applause he imagined in paradise, a reward for his unwavering, brutal devotion to the cause. He had built an entire theology around the rejection of earthly existence, a philosophy he summarized with a stark, unsettling comparison. We love death. The US loves life. To him, this was not a morbid obsession, but the ultimate expression of spiritual superiority. To cling to this world was a sign of weakness, of a soul chained to fleeting pleasures. To embrace martyrdom, however, was to prove one's devotion to the eternal, to trade a temporary and flawed life for a guaranteed place in heaven. This love of death was his ultimate weapon, a force that his enemies, who cherished their fragile lives, could never comprehend or defeat. It was the foundation of his power, the dark jewel in his crown of piety. Yet the presence before him offered no argument, no debate. It simply was. And its being was a silent, devastating rebuttal to his entire life's work. The love of death was confronted by a being that was life itself, the very source from which all existence flows. The call for a holy war was met with a silence that screamed a different, ancient law. Put your sword back in its place, for all who draw the sword will die by the sword. The Zealots' meticulously constructed fortress of belief, built on verses of wrath and promises of violent glory, began to crumble under the weight of a truth that needed no words to be understood. The Prince of Peace stood in the heart of his war room. What do you do when the God you claim to serve shows up and silently condemns your service? The Zealots' hands trembled, not with fear of this man, but with fear of the truth he represented. For the first time, the verses of vengeance felt hollow. The maps of destruction looked like pages from a madman's diary, and the love of death felt like a pathetic excuse for a life consumed by hatred. The silent figure did not judge him with fire or fury, but with a sorrow so profound it exposed his blessed terrorism for what it was, a profane and bloody sacrifice to an idol he had carved in his own image. The foundation was cracked, and a terrifying light was pouring in. The presence in the cave became an unbearable weight, a pressure not on the body, but on the very architecture of the Zealot's soul. He tried to retreat into the fortress of his mind, to summon the familiar verses of holy war that had always been his shield. But the words felt like sand slipping through his fingers. The silence emanating from the visitor was not empty. It was filled with a truth so dense it suffocated every lie. He gripped his rifle, hoping its cold, hard reality would ground him, but it felt like a child's toy. The man who had commanded armies and brought nations to their knees found himself disarmed by stillness, his authority dissolving under a gaze that demanded nothing and saw everything. He clung to the justification of his life's work, the idea of a blessed terrorism to cleanse the world. In his mind, he was a shepherd protecting his flock with a sword. But the silent being before him was a living mirror, and in its reflection the shepherd's robes vanished. An ancient, unspoken law echoed off the cave walls, a truth that stripped him bare. Watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. The Zealot saw it then for a fleeting, terrifying instant. The wolf of vengeance that wore his face, the hunger for power that he had cloaked in the language of piety. His righteousness was a costume, and it was being incinerated by a holy light. The tension in the cave was no longer just spiritual, it was a collision of kingdoms. The Zealot's domain, a world of maps, targets, and strategic martyrdom, was being invaded by an authority that operated on principles he had long forgotten: forgiveness, mercy, and unconditional love. His prayer rug, once a portal to God, now felt like a stage for a grand deception. The flickering lantern light, which once illuminated his righteous path, now cast long accusatory shadows. His entire reality, built on the premise of a divine mandate for war, was being judged by a peace that was more powerful than any army. Comment here. What would you do if your life's purpose was silently condemned by its very source? He tried to rally his spirit with his darkest, most powerful conviction: his love for death. It was the ultimate rejection of his enemy's world, the ultimate proof of his devotion to the next. But this core tenet of his faith shattered against the presence of life itself. Another truth filled the suffocating silence, a direct decree from the throne of heaven he claimed to represent. As surely as I live, I take no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but rather that they turn from their ways and live. His grim romance with martyrdom was exposed for what it was, not a holy sacrifice, but a profound blasphemy against a God who weeps for every soul, even the ones he deemed worthless. The judgment was complete. There was no thunder, no divine wrath, no condemnation spoken aloud. There was only the profound, heartbreaking sorrow radiating from the Son of God, a sorrow that was in itself the final verdict. The Zealot stood spiritually naked, his ideological armor pierced, and his justifications turned to ash. He had built a kingdom to honor God, only to find that his entire life was an offense to the very heart of heaven. The silence that followed was not one of peace but of conviction, the terrible, undeniable certainty of a man who has just been judged not by an enemy, but by the love he betrayed. The silence in the cave was no longer an accusation, it had become a mirror. The Zealot, unable to bear the weight of the still presence before him, turned his gaze to the familiar comfort of his maps. He traced the lines of planned attacks, the cities marked for ruin, trying to anchor himself in the certainty of his mission. He was a righteous instrument, he told himself, a surgeon performing a necessary, painful operation on a world dying from a spiritual cancer. The world required a leader like him, one unafraid to use fire to purify, one who understood that true faith demanded sacrifice, not just of the self, but of the enemy. His was the hard path, the one chosen by prophets and warriors, and this unsettling peace was merely a temptation to abandon it. But the mirror was not made of glass. It was forged from truth, and it could not be ignored. The silent figure of Jesus became a reflection of the zealot's own soul, and the image it cast back was horrifying. Every justification, every verse he had twisted into a weapon, was now turned back on him. His identity as a divine judge, a man who could separate the righteous from the wicked with bombs and bullets, was met with a simple, devastating spiritual law that echoed in the chamber of his mind. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? The Grand Inquisitor of nations was suddenly confronted by the massive, splintered beam of his own hatred, a beam that had blinded him for years. The plank in his own eye was his life's work. Memories, once trophies of his holy war, now flashed before him as exhibits of his hypocrisy. He saw himself celebrating the fall of towers, praising the martyrdom of young men he had sent to their deaths, and calling the slaughter of innocents a divine victory. He had built a throne upon a mountain of corpses and called it a house of prayer. He tried to argue back in the court of his own mind, insisting that his enemies deserved their fate, that their corrupt culture was an affront to God. But the mirror showed him not their sins, but his own reaction to them, a reaction so filled with pride and vengeance it had eclipsed the very God he claimed to serve. He fought to shatter the reflection, mentally listing the sins of the West, their greed, their arrogance, their godless ways. He was a reaction, a consequence, a necessary antibody to a global disease. Surely God understood that such an enemy could only be met with unyielding force. But the silent presence offered no agreement, no acknowledgement of his enemy's faults. It only held the mirror steady, forcing him to look deeper into the source of his own actions. Another truth surfaced, simple and absolute. For out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. His speeches calling for death, his sermons sanctifying terror, his entire gospel of blessed terrorism, they were not from God. They were the overflow of a heart poisoned by its own bitterness. The ideological armor, once impenetrable, began to crack. The zealot saw the vast, terrifying distance between the God of mercy, described in his sacred texts, and the idol of vengeance he had meticulously crafted in his own image. The reflection showed him not a holy warrior, but a man enslaved by his own rage, a false prophet who had become the first and most devoted follower of his own deception. The mirror did not show him a monster, but something far worse. A man who had been given a choice between love and had chosen hate, convincing himself it was the holiest path. And you? Would you have the courage to look inside if you were before Jesus? Comment below. The climax was not a battle of swords, but of silence. The air in the cave grew so thick with unspoken truth that it felt hard to breathe. The zealot, for the first time in his life, felt his convictions waver, not under threat, but under the weight of a sorrowful, unwavering gaze. He tried to mentally retreat to his justifications, to the verses of Scripture he had weaponized, to the unshakable belief that he was a divine instrument. He was not evil, he told himself. He was a necessary response to a godless world. The world needed a leader strong enough to use fire to carve a path of righteousness through the flesh of the corrupt. His war was not a choice, but a destiny. But the silent figure of Jesus became a living judgment, a presence that held up a mirror to his soul. In that invisible reflection, the zealot did not see the sins of his enemies. He saw the faces of his victims, not as faceless infidels or collateral damage, but as children playing in a park, mothers singing lullabies, fathers heading to work, souls created and cherished by the very God he claimed to serve. His blessed terrorism was suddenly revealed for what it was, a profane feast of death laid at the altar of a false god he had built from his own rage. The justification for their deaths dissolved into the horrifying reality of their lives. The reflection shifted, and the most terrifying image of all appeared, himself. Not the stoic, pious warrior who graced his own propaganda, but a small, frightened man, so consumed by bitterness that it had become the very core of his being. He saw the vast, horrifying chasm between the God of mercy and the idol of vengeance he truly worshipped. An ancient truth echoed in the tomb of his heart, exposing the root of his entire mission. For from within, out of a person's heart, come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, pride, and foolishness. His holy war was nothing more than the grandest, most elaborate act of foolish pride in human history. He fought back in the silence, clinging to his most potent doctrine: we love death, the US loves life. It was his ultimate spiritual weapon, the proof of his superiority. But standing before the author of life, the words became a pathetic blasphemy. The presence before him did not need to speak. Its very being was a declaration of a different, higher law. A truth that shattered his love for death echoed through the cave. As surely as I live, declares the sovereign Lord, I take no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but rather that they turn from their ways and live. His ultimate devotion was a direct offense to the heart of heaven. The armor of righteousness was gone, incinerated by a light that was not fire but love. He stood spiritually naked, his life's work exposed as a monument to his own brokenness. There was no condemnation, no booming voice from the heavens, only the crushing weight of a truth he could no longer deny. He had built a kingdom to honor God, only to discover he had been at war with him all along. The choice was now his, to embrace the terrifying light or retreat into the familiar darkness of his cause. And you? Would you have the courage to look inside if you were before Jesus? Comment here below. Jesus was gone, but the silence he left behind was a living entity. It was no longer a void, but a presence filled with the ghost of a truth the zealot could not unsee. He scrambled to rebuild the walls of his conviction, to dismiss the encounter as a hallucination, a test from Shaitan sent to break his resolve. He was a warrior, he reminded himself, and the world required a leader like him, one who understood that purity is only achieved through fire. He had been chosen for this path because he was strong enough to bear the burden of necessary violence. This was not a sin. It was a sacred duty, and the unsettling peace he had felt was merely the ultimate temptation to abandon it. But the foundation of his faith was now fractured. He looked at his maps, the familiar lines and targets that once brought him a sense of clarity and purpose. Now they were haunted. He saw not strategic locations, but the faint superimposed images of the faces from the mirror, the laughing child, the worried mother, the tired father. His grand theology of blessed terrorism now felt like a child's clumsy excuse for cruelty. He tried to summon the familiar rage against his enemies, to list their sins, their decadence, their godlessness. He was their consequence, he insisted in the court of his own mind. But the verdict had already been delivered in the silence, and his justifications were now just echoes in an empty tomb. The mirror of Christ, though vanished, had left its reflection seared upon his soul. An inescapable law, one he had often quoted to his followers, but never applied to himself, now echoed in the desolate quiet of the cave. Do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows. For years, he believed he was sowing the seeds of divine justice, destined to reap a harvest of glory in paradise. But now, a terrifying new understanding took root. He had sown death, violence, and hatred. What if the harvest was not heaven, but simply more of the same, an endless, meaningless cycle of destruction, with his own soul at its desolate center? His entire life's work was built on the image of a shepherd protecting his flock from wolves. Now he was forced to confront the horrifying possibility that he was the wolf, cloaked in the shepherd's own garments. He remembered his speeches, the sermons celebrating martyrdom, the venomous joy he took in the fall of his enemies. Were those the words of a holy man or a predator grooming his pack? He had promised his followers a path to God, but what if he had only shown them the path to his own rage, leading them not to paradise, but to the same spiritual abyss he now found himself staring into? And you? Would you have the courage to look inside if you were before Jesus? Comment here below. The ultimate consequence of the encounter was not conversion, but corruption. The Zealots' war would continue, but the pure, unshakable fire of conviction was gone, replaced by the cold, dead ash of a truth he could not escape. He would still give orders, still inspire young men to die for his cause, but a part of him would remain forever trapped in that cave, standing before that silent, sorrowful gaze. The choice had been made. He had seen the face of perfect love and reaffirmed his allegiance to hate. And that single silent decision was a spiritual wound that would never heal, a poison that would consume his cause from the inside out. The encounter was over, but the war within the man had just begun. He desperately tried to reassemble the fragments of his shattered conviction, telling himself the presence was a phantom, a final cunning test of his faith sent by the great deceiver. He was a warrior, a divine instrument, and this world of corruption required a leader who was not afraid to use fire. His path was a sacred burden, one he was chosen to bear precisely because he was strong enough to wield the sword of righteousness without flinching. The profound, unsettling peace he had felt was not a call to mercy. It was the ultimate temptation to abandon his holy duty, a whisper of weakness he must now violently reject. But the silence Jesus left behind was not empty. It was an echo chamber for a truth he could not escape. He stared at his maps, but the lines marking cities for destruction were now overlaid with the haunting images from the spiritual mirror, the faces of children, of mothers, of ordinary men. His grand theology of a blessed terrorism now felt like a profane and childish excuse for cruelty. He tried to summon the familiar righteous anger against his enemies, to list their sins and decadence in the court of his own mind. But the verdict had already been delivered in that suffocating stillness, and his justifications were now nothing more than hollow echoes in a tomb of his own making. The mirror of Christ, though gone, had seared a spiritual law onto his soul, a principle he had often preached but never applied to himself. Do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows. For years he believed he was sowing divine justice, destined to reap a harvest of glory. But a new, terrifying understanding began to sprout in the barren soil of his heart. He had sown hatred, vengeance, and death. What if the harvest was not paradise, but simply more of the same, an endless, meaningless cycle of destruction with his own soul trapped at its desolate center? And you? Would you have the courage to look inside if you were before Jesus? Comment here below. His entire identity was built on being the shepherd who protected the flock from wolves. Now he was forced to stare at the horrifying reflection of the wolf wearing the shepherd's robes. He was the false prophet, and an ancient warning now screamed in his mind. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. He remembered his sermons celebrating martyrdom, the venomous joy he took in the fall of his enemies. Were those the words of a holy man or a predator grooming his pack for slaughter? He had promised his followers a path to God, but what if he had only shown them the path to his own rage, leading them not to heaven, but to the same spiritual abyss he now found himself staring into? The final consequence was not conversion, but a profound and eternal corruption. The Zealots' war would continue, but the pure, unshakable fire of conviction was gone, replaced by the cold, dead ash of a truth he chose to ignore. He would still give orders and inspire young men to die for his cause, but a part of him would remain forever trapped in that cave, standing before that silent, sorrowful gaze. He had seen the face of perfect love and reaffirmed his allegiance to hate. And that single, silent decision was a spiritual wound that would never heal, consuming his cause from the inside out. While the world bows to power, we choose to follow the truth. Subscribe so you don't miss the next confrontation between heaven and earth.